Hey everyone, welcome today. I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. Peter Rogers. Once again, someone many of you already know for his deep, insightful work in health and medicine. And Dr. Rogers has authored a number of really comprehensive books, often hundreds of pages long, that go deep into topics like nutrition, chronic disease, optimal health, books, packed with science, clarity, and a sense of purpose. Now, I'm currently down here in Mexico, and since Dr. Rogers' newest book just came out, I haven't had a chance to get my hands on a copy of it yet, but I didn't want to wait because this one is different. It's called Prevent and Reverse Diabetes. And in contrast to some of his earlier, more encyclopedic works, this time he's distilled it all down to just the essentials. This book, it's shorter. I understand it's more focused, and above all, it's incredibly useful. So whether you or someone you love is dealing with diabetes, or you just want to understand what actually causes it and how to take control of your health, this is the conversation that you need to hear. So today, Dr. Rogers is going to walk us through things like what inspired this book, why diabetes isn't just treatable, but in many cases it's curable, and what people need to know right now about diet, fat, insulin resistance, and more, and how this book is designed to actually help people get better. It's practical and it's clear how you can do it quickly. So I just want to tell you, one of the things we've been doing in Mexico, I can move out of the way, is my wife is watching these eagles on this channel. It's 24 hours a day of these eagles that have been born and hatched, and now they're, I don't know how many weeks old, and everyone sits there and watches it. That's what's going on behind me. Anyhow, Peter, are you going to take us through the book today? What are we doing?
I'm going to show a little bit from the book, but then I'm going to go into a lot more advanced, interesting things about cognitive decline in diabetes, what you can do to prevent it. The book is more like a manual. How do you get better? And I intentionally started off with the causes of diabetes and what you need to do to get better, because I know a lot of people, they don't want to read a lot. And it was sort of like what made me do this book. I wanted to write this other big volume. That's what I like writing. But like my girlfriend goes, no, people aren't like you. They don't care about all these other diseases. They don't care about all this physiology. All they want to know is what I need to do to get better. Just make one little book about diabetes. Don't combine everything. Your books are too long. Nobody can afford them. Nobody's going to read them. So I said, okay, fine. I'll just make a diabetes book. So that's what happened.
I love it. Well, yeah, it sounds like you're proving her right, or she was right with this book. I love the concept. All right, why don't you start your slides there? I know you got some stuff you're gonna, and I'll.
Yep. Okay. This is the photo on the cover of the book. Christ giving the keys of heaven to St. Peter, in a sense, here's the key to getting better from diabetes. Okay. So the title of the book is Prevent and Reverse Diabetes. Just came out. The table of contents: what causes diabetes. The disclaimer is just that you got to work with your healthcare provider, because your blood sugar and your blood pressure are going to drop like a rock probably, and you don't want to be taking your old medication dosages, or you'll overtreat yourself. You'll become hypotensive, you'll become hypoglycemic, and you can pass out. So make sure you work with your healthcare provider when you make a big diet change. Okay, so right in the first chapter, we talk about what causes diabetes. And you can really phrase that as what causes insulin resistance. And dietary fat is the most important thing, especially saturated fat. Okay, and if you can get your number of calories from fat down to 10% or less, you're very likely you'll have dramatically improved insulin sensitivity. Some people even think all you got to do is get it to 15%, like the Mastering Diabetes guy, Bobby Bittero and Cyrus Kumbada. But I would even go for 10%. Roy Taylor, sort of a famous MD, English guy. He's like, diabetes is simply a condition of fat excess, is what he says. I got lots and lots of footnotes in here because I want it for people. I know most people don't care about that, but for people who do, they're there. Okay, dietary fat is caused by overnutrition, which means too much fat gets into the skeletal muscle. Okay, now we're going to go into a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm going to go into a whole bunch of stuff that you've never seen before. I don't care who you are. You will never have seen many of the things I'm going to cover in this talk. First of all, we'll talk briefly about Dr. McDougall. Dr. McDougall died 1 year ago in June, okay? And he sort of kept us in touch with all the true history of nutrition and health, okay? And he's got a great lecture on the internet at his YouTube channel. He's got a lot of great lectures here at VegSource that summarize the research papers on diabetes and related topics. He'll go through all the classic landmark papers, J. Shirley Sweeney, Rabinowitz, Hemsworth, Kempner, Pritikin, etc. And here's some of the things that he said. Dietary fat paralyzes the insulin receptor. Fat is the biggest toxin in the Western diet. The fat you eat is the fat you wear. The higher the percentage of calories you eat from dietary fat, the more fat you're likely to be, the fatter the population. To be healthy, people should eat a starch-based diet with about 90% of calories from starch, 5% of calories from fruit, and 5% of calories from vegetables. All large, healthy populations have eaten starch-based diets. There are no exceptions. You can see the truth. Just look around you. Back when Asian populations ate a diet based on starch, on rice, 1 billion out of 1 billion were thin. It's just about impossible to get type 2 diabetes when eating the McDougall diet, okay? And I can tell you, I've been a doctor over 30 years. The most important thing I ever learned is that humans should eat starch. Because if you know that, you could be healthy. You could avoid all these Western diseases. Okay, what I did was I made a list of the things that cause insulin resistance. And while fat is the most important one, especially sat fat, there's a bunch of other things that cause it as well, and it would be wise to avoid them. So the next one is omega-6 cooking oils. They both have a toxic effect on intermitochondrial membrane electron transport through the toxic aldehydes like HNE, hydroxynonenal, but there's another way that they're bad. Tetsumori Yamashima, Japanese MD, PhD, he figured out that they also damage the cells in the pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreatic islets, the ones that make the insulin. That's a big deal. I would never eat fried food, okay? It's really bad for you. Okay, any food with oil, I would recommend 0 oil, not 1 drop, okay? Increase intracellular calcium, and that you get increase intracellular calcium. I'm gonna explain why in a moment in this talk, either by eating too much salt, sodium chloride, or by eating not enough potassium and magnesium. So basically not eating plants. Plants got the good stuff, potassium, magnesium, okay? Processed food and meat has the bad stuff. Typically meat's flavored with salt or preserved with it. Okay, I'll explain and why that's bad in a moment. What are some other things? Anything that raises cortisol. So being stressed out raises cortisol. Cortisol and catecholamine hormones. And cortisol, you know, is for being chased by a tiger in the dark. That's what the stress response is all about, physical. So it cranks up your blood glucose and cranks up your blood lipids to provide energy to survive the next 30 minutes. But in the modern world, people are stressed out day after day after day and running high blood sugars, running high blood lipids, and that contributes to insulin resistance. Cortisol medications do it as well. Lack of sleep raises the same hormones. Caffeine raises the same hormones. So all of those things contribute to insulin resistance. Being sedentary, I'll explain why in a moment, that decreases your insulin resistance. You have less GLUT4 transporter receptors up in your plasma membrane of your skeletal muscle. You don't want that. A lot of foods and personal care products, they're contaminated with these estrogenic chemicals, and those promote weight gain, which increases your risk of diabetes. They also quite often are inhibitors of the mitochondria, and we're going to come to that in a moment. Atrazine is a mitochondrial inhibitor, BPA is a mitochondrial inhibitor, etc. Okay, also glyphosate. Glyphosate is what's sprayed. You know, we always think of it as being non-organic soy, but it's sprayed on a lot more than that. This lady here from MIT, she wrote an entire book about all the complications of glyphosate. It's actually a great book, but it's also a lot of small print with not pictures in a big biochemistry book. Okay, one of the things glyphosate is strongly associated with is fatty liver. And fatty liver can then progress from non-alcoholic fatty liver, NAFL, to NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, to cirrhosis, cancer, and all that bad stuff. Fatty liver is like saying pre-diabetes, diabetes of the liver. And then people say, well, you know, it's just non-organic soy. No, no, no. It's very often used for all kinds of plants. It's not just soy. There's over 70 things that are sprayed with glyphosate. I got this list here. You could look it up on the internet pretty easy, and it's on a lot of stuff. That's why I only eat organic. I think that non-organic food is more sprayed than it used to be, and so that's why I'm a big believer only organic. Okay, I realized in the past that wasn't such a big deal, but I think I'll just give you my opinion. You don't have to follow it, but that's what I would recommend if it's possible. Okay. All these processed foods are terrible. They basically bring people into a research institute and their test audience, and they titrate the amount of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, which is terrible stuff, sprayed with atrazine, the amount of fat in there. They often fry the food in some way. They put chemicals in there for mouth texture, lots of salt, lots of monosodium glutamate, manufactured free glutamate. and they reach what's called the bliss point where the people become addicted to it. When people eat processed food, they have a tendency to get fat and sick. Okay, what diabetes is really about primarily, there's a lot to it, but the primary issue is too much fat. Okay, it starts out with fat accumulating in the skeletal muscle. They sometimes call that intramyo. Myo is muscle, intra is inside, intramyocellular, inside the skeletal muscle cells, lipid. Intramyocellular lipid is the first detectable finding of diabetes, insulin resistance. And then you can't take the glucose into the muscle after eating, so you get, prandial means eating, so you get postprandial hyperglycemia. Eventually, the fat accumulates to the point where you get a diffuse fatty liver. I can tell you fatty liver is so common. There are some days when I see, let's say, 20 livers, okay? And it's routine that about 18, 19 out of the 20 are fatty liver, meaning the patients have prediabetes and diabetes. It is so common, it's like normal aging in the United States, okay? But it's not normal, it's bad, all right? So fatty liver is like prediabetes, diabetes of the liver. And the fat just keeps accumulating in spots where it's not supposed to go. You're supposed to have fat in your subcutaneous tissues, and that can help you survive a food shortage in the winter. That's why our bodies are so good at storing fat. But you don't want it in places where it doesn't belong. It doesn't belong in your skeletal muscle. It doesn't belong in your liver. And then even worse, it doesn't belong in your pancreas. Talk to any radiologist. Ask them, do they ever see fatty atrophy of the pancreas? They will tell you they see it all the time. Destruction, replacement of the pancreas by fat tissue in type 2 diabetes. Okay, and once all this stuff happens, you can no longer produce insulin. You start getting all these secondary complications of diabetes. Retinopathy, going blind, kidneys failing, microvasculopathy in the foot getting chopped off. Every day I see amputations from diabetic feet. Okay, every day I see a bunch of patients in kidney failure. And most common reason they die is from a heart attack, okay? And plus, they often suffer the other complications that go before it: atrial fibrillation, congestive heart failure, cerebral vascular disease. Diabetics are routinely cognitively impaired, okay? We're going to come to that in a moment. Here's what insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity is all about. First of all, we're going to talk about normal. This is normal. Insulin binds the receptor on the skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the most important thing to start talking out, because after you eat, about 70% or so of that glucose, extra glucose, is going to go to your skeletal muscles and be stored as glycogen, okay? So that's where you want it to go. Your skeletal muscles are the biggest organ system in your entire body. So insulin binds the receptors on the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle, the insulin receptor, and that initiates a cascade of reactions that cause the glucose type 4 transporters, so that's glucose type 4. These transporters go up to the plasma membrane, and then they merge, these glucose channels, the GLUT4s, merge with the plasma membrane. They allow glucose to come into the cell. That is normal insulin sensitivity. That is what you want. That is a good response to insulin. Okay, you also want to exercise, because when you exercise, that also causes these glucose type 4 transporters to go up to the plasma membrane. And, you know, if somebody has diabetes, it's a good idea they get in the habit of exercising, because it'll dramatically improve insulin sensitivity. And, you know, just good to see this right here, the life cycle of a sea squirt. A sea squirt in its juvenile phase swims around. It has a brain. It's like a little tadpole. But then when it's an adult, it attaches to a rock and becomes a filter feeder. Its entire brain is reabsorbed, because you don't need a brain if you sit on your butt like a filter feeder, you know, just watching TV all day. And I'm telling you, one of the best predictors of healthy aging is that a person exercises a lot, in terms of not only maintaining physical fitness, but maintaining cognitive fitness and avoiding things like diabetes. Now, Walter Kempner, back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, he was curing diabetes type 2 routinely with his rice diet. Now, he initially had patients primarily because they had severe hypertension, also because they had kidney failure. There weren't any really good medications for hypertension in those days. There wasn't any dialysis, so it was either the diet works or the patient dies, okay? And he saved lots and lots of patients. His diet was 93% carbohydrate, 4% protein, and 3% fat. So it's important to look at those numbers. Less than 5% of calories from protein, less than 5% of calories from fat, over 90% from carbohydrate. It's important to see that. And Dr. McDougall said virtually all of his type 2 diabetics were cured. I tell you this because you need to know the truth. This is what cures people. Okay, now don't get me wrong. Kempner's diet was kind of extreme. Okay, they were eating white rice and fruits and fruit juices, and he'd give them a multivitamin. Okay, he only was restricting calories. My understanding of it, according to what Frank Nealon said, and from what I could gather from reading about it, was he's only calorie restricting the patients that were trying to lose weight. But calorie restriction is another thing. If a person loses a lot of weight, let's say more than 30 pounds, they often will cure type 2 diabetes. But they need to do something that maintains it long term. But anyways, just be aware, it's known you can easily cure it if you drop the weight. There was a study that just came out recently. I think it came out of Chinese researchers, some of them at least. And what they found is they're sort of claiming they've got an 87% cure rate for type 2 diabetes. Here's the paper right here, randomized control trial. But when you look a little more closely at the paper and they go with medicines and with a high protein diet, you go, hold on a second, let me look at this more closely. All of these patients were calorie restricted, 500 calories per day to cause weight loss. And they lost a lot of weight. And what I'm trying to say is they lost on average about, I think it was like 35, 40 pounds, something like that. Okay, 42.3 pounds. All right, well, that's what cured them. Okay, if you lose weight from any reason, you can cure type 2 diabetes. But the point is, you're only cured while you're going through that regimen of the study. In any study, you get something called the Hawthorne effect. By paying more attention to people, they pay more attention to their habits. They're more rigorous with their following their disciplined diet, if you will. But what I'm trying to say is, whatever diet you eat every day the rest of your life, it should not be an ordeal. It should be a pleasure. The low-fat vegan diet's a pleasure. I'm very happy to eat it. I'm 61. I'm aging better than all my friends, all my family, all my colleagues, all my coworkers. I like that. Okay. Anyways, 87% cure rate, but like I said, it's just from losing the weight. And that's been shown. Roy Taylor had shown if you can get patients to lose over 30 pounds, they'll routinely have their fatty liver go away and be cured of their diabetes. All of his patients less than 4 years with type 2 diabetes were cured. He says when you get to 8 to 10 years, you still can cure most of them, but the longer the person has type 2 diabetes, the more they've got fatty atrophy of their pancreas, destruction of the pancreatic beta cells, and they will have lost the ability to produce insulin. You'll still get some, even 15, 20 years out, you can cure, but fewer and fewer percentage of them will be curable the more time that goes by. And like I said, most Americans, middle-aged and older, have fatty liver nowadays. In my experience, I see it all day long, every day. Okay, here's the guy who really broke things open on a research front. This is Michael Brownlee. He has a type 1 diabetes. He was told as a young man that he'd probably be dead in his early 30s. He didn't like that, and he decided to devote his entire life to researching diabetes. By the way, type 1 diabetes is most often caused by autoimmune response to dairy, okay? There's a whole bunch of papers on that. We're only going to talk about type 2 today, but you should know about it because these type 1 guys have done some interesting things. All right, so he had type 1 diabetes, devoted his life to researching it. He figured out that fat obstructs the electron transport chain on the inner mitochondrial membrane in the region of coenzyme Q and complex 3. So the way the mitochondria work is in the inner mitochondrial membrane, protons are pumped into the intramembranous space. There's an outer mitochondrial membrane here, so the space in between is the intramembranous space. And that generates a proton gradient, okay? And then it is harvested, the gradient, by allowing a proton to come back in through ATP synthase, which rotates it, and in so doing, a phosphate is added to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with 2, to become adenosine triphosphate with 3 phosphates, okay? And then the electrons, basically what happens is the body, it's genius, splits the atom of hydrogen into a proton, the positively charged, and an electron, negatively charged. The electron is passed on a gradient of electron grabbers, like a snowball rolling down a hill, until it reaches the most aggressive electron grabber, which is oxygen, the ultimate electron acceptor, okay? And that's how life on Earth works. That's where energy comes from. That's oxidative phosphorylation in mitochondria. So here's a drawing of the outer mitochondrial membrane, OMM, inner mitochondrial membrane, IMM, okay? And here's where fat blocks it, especially saturated fat, but remember that fat's bad, okay? All right, and so this is coenzyme Q, complex 1, 2, 3, okay? Cytochrome C is right in here. All right, so now guess what? Hydroxynonenal, the toxic aldehyde produced from eating fried food, omega-6 cooking oils, that also blocks ATP synthase. Not good. This is a guy by the name of Chris Knob, ophthalmologist, and he tracked the epidemiology from a bunch of different countries. And the conclusion he came to is that vegetable oils had the strongest correlation with the epidemic of increasing obesity, okay? And it was not simple sugars, and it was not other things that people might think. So that's rather interesting. Here's a paper about the role of mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance. And let's see what they have to say here. They say, our observations suggest that mitochondrial dysfunction might be the central cause of insulin resistance. Yeah, okay, that's kind of like what Brownlee said, but notice they're not limiting it to fat. Here's another paper about the eyeball, diabetic retinopathy, and the role of mitochondria. Here's what they say. We conclude that retinal bioenergetics is affected in the early stages of diabetes with consequences beyond the changes in ATP content, and that maintaining mitochondrial integrity might alleviate retinal disease. You think? Okay, so what am I showing you here? I knew that there had to be more things going on with the mitochondria. I said, I got to understand this better. I knew about fat from the Brownlee paper years ago, but I knew that there had to be more going on with the mitochondria. So I went back through all my biochemistry books. I was very interested in biochemistry as a young man. I considered being a biochemist. I got like 7 biochemistry textbooks, including recent editions of several of them. Okay? I could find nothing, not one single mitochondrial inhibitor. I go, that's not right. That can't be right. So I started going through all the papers. I quickly found 10 mitochondrial inhibitors, then 20, then 30, then 40, then 50, then 60, then 70. And so, of course, I know what a lot of people are thinking. Oh, well, it's probably a bunch of rare research chemicals. Tell me if you ever heard of some of these. Tylenol, metformin, statins, glyphosate, atrazine, fluoride, lead, BPA. Sound familiar? Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, antidepressants, also tricyclic antidepressants, also antipsychotics for the treatment of schizophrenia and psychotic episodes like Haldol, dry cleaning chemicals like TCE, trichloroethylene, pain medicines like Tramadol, some anticoagulation medicines like Plavix, a lot of antibiotics, fluoroquinolones, penicillin beta-lactams, aminoglycosides, kind of scary, tetracyclines, common cardiac meds, beta blockers, alcohol, kind of scary, huh? Chronic corticosteroids, SERCA inhibitors. So anyways, I show you that because I'm trying to tell you a lot of people are on all these medicines, also atrazine, we mentioned that, the estrogenic mitochondrial inhibitor. I don't think you're going to get too much success if your goal of achieving health is to poison your way to health, okay? Sometimes a person needs a medicine, but the habitual taking of multiple medicines with multiple inhibitors of your mitochondria, I don't think you're going to get as healthy as you want, okay? And cyanogenic chemicals do it too. That's why I would never take cyanocobalamin. I take methylcobalamin. All right. Another interesting guy, here's this guy, Gerald Shulman, another genius. This is a guy who was an MD, PhD from Harvard. Then he went over to Yale and is doing research with MRI, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And his group, they were actually working, Roy Taylor worked with him for a while as well. They confirmed that the earliest finding of insulin resistance is the accumulation of fat in the skeletal muscle called intramyocellular lipid. Okay, and they tested it backwards and forwards. He's been doing this for a long time. He won the Banting Award 2018 as the greatest diabetes researcher in the world. The guy I showed you earlier, Michael Brownlee, won it in 2004. The guy I mentioned earlier, Roy Taylor, won it in 2012. Okay, they figured it out. This is Gerald Shulman's summary of diabetes, and basically, it's a problem of abnormal fat storage. Initially, accumulation of fat in the skeletal muscle where it does not belong. Then you get postprandial after eating high glucose, hyperglycemia, postprandial hyperglycemia. Then in the liver, so the liver no longer can properly regulate and monitor blood glucose because the liver's main job, why do you have a liver? To make sure the brain has enough blood glucose while you're fasting. The liver's the metabolic workhorse factory center of the human body. It's a giant thing. After the skeletal muscle, it's the next biggest organ. It stores glycogen, it runs gluconeogenesis, biochemical pathways to make sure you got enough blood glucose going into your blood for your brain. Okay, so it's not supposed to be storing significant amounts of fat. When that becomes fat, it can't monitor glucose properly, and it keeps on pushing glucose into the blood, so you get fasting hyperglycemia. Then you eventually get so much fat, it starts accumulating in the pancreas, and it has a toxic effect in the pancreas, can induce, like a protein unfolding response, and it'll destroy the pancreatic beta cells. And once those are all gone, Bye-bye insulin. That's the only spot you've got insulin production is in those beta cells of the pancreas. And you can't remake them after you're 20 years of age. Okay, so once they're gone, it's bye-bye. That's what I mean by a person should get their act together. The sooner the better, because there are some things that disappear and you have irreversible damage and there's nothing you could do about them, like the ascending aorta Windkessel effect. You can't replace those elastic fibers after 20 years of age. You can't replace pancreas beta cells after 20 years of age. So, you want to get your act together, the sooner the better. Another question that comes up is, well, why is fat so bad? Okay. And we talked about how to get into the skeletal muscle, the glucose needs insulin as sort of an escort to open up the key. Okay. It ain't like that for fat. Fat can just approach the skeletal muscle plasma membrane, and then it can get protonated. It can intercalate itself into the outer leaflet of the plasma membrane. Then it can do a flip-flop maneuver, get into the inner leaflet of the plasma membrane, and then go into the cytoplasm. Some people call this a mass action effect. It's also been described in the literature as the flip-flop maneuver. Here's a nice paper describing that by Anthony J. James Hamilton, 2020. This is not the Anthony J. who wrote the Estrogen Generation book. It's a different guy, okay? Putative inhibitors of fatty acid transport across membranes, okay? What they found was they could inhibit all the things that they thought might transport fat across the membrane. It did not matter. Fat would go into the skeletal muscle in direct proportion to the amount that was eaten, that was in the blood, okay? So there's no other way other than to reduce dietary fat, to reduce that fat going into your skeletal muscle. And also being obese is bad because fat people release more lipid into their blood, and so it's going to get into the skeletal muscle. And being stressed out, caffeine, sleep deprivation, they're also going to increase blood lipids, and you're going to get more fat in your skeletal muscle. Okay, excessive dietary high fructose corn syrup, fatty liver, alcohol, things that increase blood lipids, they're going to increase more fat getting into your skeletal muscle. Okay. All right. Now here's where you get insulin resistant. Too much fat gets into the mitochondria, and then the mitochondria sends a message to the plasma membrane and says, "Hey, I got too much fat. Leave me alone. I can't handle this. I cannot handle any more nutrients coming into the cell, coming into my mitochondria, or it's going to die. It's going to go into apoptosis, programmed cell death." We have to shut down the allowance of glucose coming into the cell. So now when insulin binds to the cell, the glucose type 4 transporters, they're blocked from going up to the plasma membrane. So the glucose can't get into the skeletal muscle and it remains high in the blood. So this would be after eating and can't get into the skeletal muscle, postprandial hyperglycemia. Okay. And as a matter of fact, if you go back to the thinking of Gerald Shulman, what Gerald Shulman believes is happening is that in some sense, the body is confused, because normally a person would have hyperlipidemia for prolonged amounts of time in their blood when they were starving and they were just burning their fat. And then insulin resistance would make sense because it would be a way for the body to preserve its shortage of glucose for the brain. Okay. So the body's confused. All right. We're not made to eat persistent, one high fat meal here and there is no big deal, but to eat them, twice a day, every day, day after day, our body's not made for that. Okay. All right. This just shows you some of the additional complications that start happening when you have a blockage at a level of complex 3 in your intermitochondrial membrane. These electrons can't get past. Normally it's like a fireman bucket brigade handing electrons off down the chain until they reach the ultimate grabber, which is oxygen. Well, right here, when they can't get through, they start dropping. It's actually because you send too many electron carriers up to the early part of the intermitochondrial membrane, and it pumps the gradient too high and things reverse. They go backwards. Brownlee figured this all out. It's beautiful. His paper, by the way, is like the Sistine Chapel of diabetes papers. It's magnificent. It's beyond beautiful. I almost cried when I read it, Michael Brownlee's paper, the pathobiology of unifying theory of diabetes complications. Anyways, so when this backs up, you start dropping electrons down onto oxygen inside of the mitochondrial matrix. They'll produce free radicals like superoxide here, and that can combine with other things and cause more trouble. And if you have free iron in the mitochondria, it'll run the Fenton reaction, all kinds of bad things, and all these other pathways get going. We don't have time to go into all of that, but trust me, it's all bad. Okay. Oh, one of them that gets activated is, it's a long story, but you're going to end up having reversal in your Krebs cycle, reversal glycolysis, and in particular, you're going to get inhibition of this glycolysis enzyme. So glycolysis is a biochemical pathway in the cytoplasm. You're going to inhibit glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. And when this gets blocked, this is right where glycolysis switches from 6-carbon phase to 3-carbon phase. Right here, when this is blocked, you're going to start running a side path, in particular something called MGO, methyl glyoxal. and that is going to glycate things. Glycation is when a sugar binds to a protein, in a non-enzymatic way, distorts its structure, and typically, damages its function. So it glycates things inside the cell, glycates things in the extracellular space, extracellular matrix, like your collagen. Not good. That's the scaffold of your body. You don't want to mess that up. Glycates things in your blood, like your albumin. And then that can be taken up. There's receptors for advanced glycation end products. You can call it like the RAGE receptor, advanced glycation end products. And that yields these inflammatory pathways. It's all bad. But these are what is called endogenous. Endogenous means from inside the body, AGEs, advanced glycation end products. There is such a thing as AGE in foods, and these are called exogenous, meaning they come from external sources, from what you put in your mouth. Big surprise, high fat, high protein foods like meat, really high in AGEs. Look at these, off the charts. Fried bacon, 12,000. In comparison, look at something like an apple, 13. White rice, banana, carrots, 10. Nothing, okay? Barely double digits. Up here, you're in the 5 digits, okay? Not good, okay? And I'll just show you for curiosity, because a lot of people are trying to say nuts are some type of superfood. Yeah, give me a break. A lot of these nuts are in the thousands, okay? Almonds here, and it's worse, of course, if you cook them or roast them, okay? But even raw, 2,700 for chestnuts, okay? Peanuts, 8,000, okay? They're also kind of acidic. They're fat, 70 to 90%. Walnuts, 7,800, okay? I think nuts are one of those super overrated foods. Here's, let's see, a potato boiled, 17, okay? A banana, 9, all right? Okay, insulin resistance is caused by eating the dietary fat. So let's say you eat the fat first and then you follow with glucose. Your blood glucose will go very high and it'll stay elevated a prolonged amount of time. That's insulin resistance, postprandial hyperglycemia. If you just eat the starch by itself, you get a little bump in your blood glucose. That's supposed to happen. You eat it to get some more glucose into your blood, but it doesn't go that high and it stays relatively normal a prolonged amount of time. And here's blood glucose curves, postprandial, a little more variety here. So here's the last meal tailing off, blood glucose is coming down. If you eat just a simple sugar alone with no fiber to slow it down, no fat in the stomach to slow it down, you'll spike your blood glucose kind of rapidly. The pancreas will often overcompensate and it'll drive that sugar down real quick. You can also get this from some really sweet fruits. Like I get this if I drink, if I eat, let's say, bananas, okay? So I shouldn't eat bananas by themselves, all right? Now, if you eat a fruit that, if you eat the fat first, I just showed you this curve, that causes insulin resistance and you'll get prolonged postprandial hyperglycemia. Now, if you eat something with a little more fiber in it, not quite as sweet of a fruit, some of the lower in fiber starches, your blood glucose will come up a little bit. This green barrier is sort of the healthy region of blood glucose. And it's okay for it to come up a little bit postprandial. That's normal. But it won't satisfy your hunger quite as long. When there's more fiber in there, you'll satisfy your hunger longer. Like beans, for example, provide really sustained satisfaction hunger. I, by the way, eat the OMAD diet, 1 meal a day diet. I do it because it's convenient. I have to work all day. I come home, I make a video or two, and then I'll eat a dinner and then rinse and repeat the next day, okay? So I like the OMAD diet. And I can tell you, if you look at glycogen storage, it's very easy for the liver to maintain blood glucose levels for 24 hours. I've done it a million times, okay? It can, with a little bit of effort, do it for 48 hours. But beyond that, you go into ketosis, okay? If you're partially maintaining blood glucose initially, mostly by burning glycogen, stored carbohydrate in the liver, but then you start running more gluconeogenesis, making glucose through pulling things into that pathway. All right, we're not going to get into all that, but just to be aware of it. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about dietary sodium. Excessive dietary sodium increases insulin resistance, and I'm going to show you some stuff that I think is kind of cool. Every cell has plasma membrane ion pumps. The most important one right here is the potassium sodium ATP pump. And what it does is it pumps sodium out. You need to remember that. The cell must pump sodium out. You have to know that. And I'll teach you how to remember it in a moment, but just want you to know that's important. It has to pump calcium out. That's real important, okay? The ATP reactions require magnesium. I'll show you why in a moment, but you need to know that too. Magnesium is required to run ATP reactions, okay? And because we're pumping out more positive charge than we're bringing in, we have a net outward movement of current. So the current is carried by the sodium. 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in. They're all 1+ charge. So you got electrical current heading outward. This is an electrical generator. This is like a capacitor storing charge. Here's a negative charge inside the cell, negative 65 millivolt. And that's the current that, it's like, I should say it's like a battery. This is a battery, a sodium battery. And then coupled to this electrical energy, you do all the other work of the plasma membrane. You let some sodiums come in, and because they want to come in, because they're low in concentration inside the cell and they're attracted to the negative charge inside the cell, you can couple that to pumping calcium out. That's going to be a very big deal. We'll come back to that in a moment. And so when God was designing the world, okay, apparently it looks like he just started making life in the water. And if you got in the seawater, if you got seawater, you've got, we know sodium chloride is a salt of salt water in the sea. All right, so there's going to be a lot of sodium and chloride in extracellular space. And then the water rinses over the rocks, limestone, calcium carbonate. So there's a lot of calcium in the water. So you need to know that. So in the water, there's tons of sodium and tons of calcium. Well, in order for a cell to wall off its membranes and keep things out from the outside world, it has to pump out the sodium and the calcium. So you want to remember that. That's why inside a cell, if it didn't pump out the sodium and the calcium, it wouldn't be able to have anything else come inside. Otherwise, it would have too high of an osmotic concentration and it would burst, okay, because the water would just flow in. So you got to get the sodium out. You got to get the calcium out, all right? And inside the cell, you have to have a constant amount of positively charged ions. An ion is a positively charged molecule. Potassium is K. K is Latin for kalium. Na is sodium. Na means natrium in Latin. They're both 1+ charged. And these are 98% of the positively charged ions. They're called cations. So if one goes up, if you have more sodium in the cell, you must reduce potassium and vice versa. Otherwise, the cell would become too hyperosmotic and it would pull in water and it would burst. So there's no way around this. This is a physics constant. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to give the ions a personality because I think that'll make it a lot easier for you to remember them. Okay? So the personality of calcium is like a wife. And a wife is the boss of the house. A wife is like a bossy aristocrat. Okay? In small amounts, wonderful, delightful, everything is great. But a wife can sometimes be very controlling and bossy and unreasonable. She can come home after a tough day at work and be kind of grouchy and take it out on the family and start barking orders at everybody. That's what calcium does to a cell. By the way, the wife comes into the room. Everybody knows her. She tells everybody what to do. The husband is sort of like just a chump who pays the bills, okay? She's the center of attention. She controls everything. So just remember that. Calcium is the boss. Calcium is the aristocrat amongst ions. Calcium decides what gets done regardless of what anyone else wants or cares, okay? Beautiful painting, piano recital by Arturo Ricci, okay? Great Italian painter. All right, now the personality of the ions. Potassium is just a hard worker. Potassium does the dirty labor, makes things work. The hard-working middle class, okay? Potassium, here's some beautiful paintings, okay? It's getting the labor done to make sure the trains are working, the roads are made, all that stuff. That is potassium. So remember that. Potassium is a good guy. It causes vasodilation. It makes your plasma membrane ions work. It's the unsung hero worker of cell function, okay? Then there's magnesium. And magnesium is friends with potassium. They work together. Magnesium's a little bit more of a tough guy. Magnesium's sort of like a guard, a little more heroic. Overtly heroic, if you will. Here is Charlton Heston in the movie Ben-Hur controlling the horses to win the chariot races. And in a sense, that's what magnesium does with ATP. These phosphates on ATP, so this is adenosine triphosphate, tri meaning 3 phosphates, 1, 2, 3. The 2 phosphates got a big negative charge. They want to pull apart. And if you don't hang on to them tight, they will pull apart before the reaction is completed and it'll ruin the whole process. So magnesium has a 2+ positive charge, enables it to hang on to those phosphates until the reaction is at the correct position, then it lets one go wherever it needs to. You must have that for ATP reactions to work. Okay, and magnesium's heroic in another way. Magnesium guards the fort. It guards the ion channel. Here is magnesium in the center of a calcium channel in a brain cell, in a neuron. This is called the NMDA receptor for glutamate. And magnesium sits there right in the center and it blocks the calcium. No calcium is getting through until the right time. Most Americans, by the way, are deficient in magnesium because it comes from plants. It's in the center of chlorophyll. And because of that, they have a little bit of hyperexcitability of their calcium channels, their NMDA receptors in their brain cells. I think that's a little bit why they're more impulsive. So a lot of these paleo keto carnivores that are kind of impulsive and rude in the comment section, I think some of it might be because they're magnesium dependent. You can also remember magnesium, M for mellow. It mellows you out. So you don't have hyperexcitable neurons that are kind of going off for no reason, anxious and kind of crazy, impulsive. Anyways, that's something you want to remember about magnesium. It's very good. The reason it sits there is because it's attracted to the negative charge. The resting membrane potential of the cell is about negative 65 millivolts, okay? All right, so here's magnesium. It's in the center of chlorophyll. That's why you eat plants. You get all the good stuff. Plants are loaded with potassium, and they got magnesium. Okay, now here is sodium. Sodium as an ion. Sodium is the angry poor. Sodium wants to bust into the city. Like here we have Les Miserables, Victor Hugo, 1848 problems in France. All right, and here we've got another scenario where these are the German Hessian mercenaries getting across the fort in New York back in 1776. Magnificent painting, okay? Sodium's busting into that wall. You got to keep sodium out. Sodium, you don't want sodium busting in. You might let sodium in at certain times, the appropriate moment when you need to do something, but you don't want sodium just busting in when it shouldn't be. All right, now here's how a cell works. You got the plasma membrane gradients maintained by the sodium-potassium pump, and that uses about 1/3 of the energy in a regular cell and 2/3 of the energy in a neuron. Okay, anything that uses that much energy in the human body is super, 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 super important. Okay, it is the electrical battery, the sodium battery of the plasma membrane. And then when a little bit of calcium is allowed to come into the cell, it says, go, do this now. So to a neuron, it says, release your neurotransmitter now. To a pancreas beta cell, it says, release insulin now. Okay, to a skeletal muscle, it says, contract now. Calcium says, do what I say now. It's like flicking on a light switch, all right? But then you got to pump that calcium out fast so that you can shut the cell off. Imagine you were looking at it like a boxer who can punch, 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 punch. They have to move really fast. Anything that happens that fast has to be electrical, okay? In order to be able to turn on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off, you got to have that calcium going in and out incredibly fast. The NACA exchanger can pump out 5,000 calcium ions per second. It's incredible, okay? And what is it like? It's like a rotating door, in a big apartment building, big hotel or something, or even like a water wheel conceptually. You allow sodium to come in, and that's coupled to pumping calcium out because the sodium wants to come in to both for electrical reasons and concentration gradient reasons, and that's coupled to pumping calcium out. You always need some pumping power to get calcium out because remember, just like the ocean water, it's high outside the cell in sodium and in calcium. The original energy comes from this pump over here, ATP pump, because that helped us generate the sodium gradient and electrochemical gradient. And then NACA means sodium calcium exchanger, usually abbreviated NCX. Okay, that's how a cell works. That's how a cell gets stuff done. You've also got here a pump where you can have sodium come into the cell and use that to pump hydrogen protons outside the cell. Hydrogen protons are acid, to pump acid out of the cell. We're going to come back to that. That's important to remember. But that's how a cell does work across this plasma membrane with this electrical battery. And that's another example of how brilliant, incredible the design of a cell is. That the mitochondria I spoke about a moment ago is a nuclear reactor that splits the atom, generates electricity, and that the plasma membrane is an electrical battery pumping charge. Now here's what happens in a pancreas beta cell. Okay, when glucose, you eat a meal, glucose elevates in the portal vein, glucose comes up and starts moving around the pancreas beta cells. When the glucose comes into the cell, it generates ATP production through glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. And then the ATP has an inhibitory effect on a plasma membrane calcium channel. It stops calcium from going out of the cell. This is a unique type of calcium channel. That was making it negatively charged inside because a positive charge was exiting the cell. This will cause the resting membrane potential to no longer be resting. It'll start drifting upward. That's called depolarization, moving close to zero. And when the cell depolarizes, then that will open up a voltage-gated calcium channel, allowing calcium to come into the cell. Elevated calcium in the cell. Like I said, calcium's the aristocrat, okay? The potassium's just a worker, okay? Calcium is the boss. Calcium comes in and says, you do this now. I told you to pick up those dishes and wash those dishes and clean your room and do this. Okay, so anyways, the calcium comes up in the cell, and then the insulin is sitting around in vesicles. They merge with the plasma membrane of the pancreas beta cell, and they're released into the blood. That's how you release insulin. But the point I'm making is if you cause the resting calcium to drift upward, you're going to have more insulin being released. Okay. In order to make sure that you've got a good amount of potassium relative to sodium so you can run those ion pumps effectively, you really should be eating a minimum of a K factor, that's ratio of potassium to sodium of at least 5-1. Meat, by the way, has a K factor of about 4 or 5-1. Okay, but processed food is very often the opposite. Processed food very routinely has more sodium than potassium. That messes up your ion gradients. Okay, that will cause hypertension and a bunch of other problems too. Okay, so I'll show you some of these foods. Here's just to give you an idea, a K factor. All right, this is actually a very important concept for preventing hypertension and sequelae of complications from excess dietary salt. All right, and hypertension. Your fruits are incredibly high in potassium relative to sodium. The K factor, now K factor again is the ratio of potassium to sodium. K factor for a banana is 450. That's not a misprint, 450. Watermelon, 270. Oranges, 250. So basically from about 100 to 500 is the K factor on your fruits, okay? You know, some of your starches are up there. Steel cut oats, about 160. Most of your oats are more in the ballpark of around 20, like black beans going up to, white rice to 60. So they're in that ballpark is typically your deal with your starches. And you just got to keep it over 5. I actually think you should try to keep it over 10. Richard Moore, who wrote the great book on hypertension, he recommends keeping it at least a 5. But our ancestors probably had it more like 16 to 20. I think more like 20. So I think it's good to have it higher just so you're aware of all this. All right, veggies are a little lower than, they're in the ballpark of, 5 to 15. Sweet potatoes about 14. You start looking at this processed food. Ground beef's about 4. Look at some of these things, like even Special K cereal, supposed to be such a great cereal. Yeah, right. I used to eat that when I was a kid. K factor 0.06. So there's more potassium. There's more sodium than there is potassium. That's bad. You don't ever want to look at potato chips, 0.9. So any K factor below 5 is bad. I won't eat any food in that range. Okay, but just so you're aware of K factors. That's an important thing to know about. Okay, another point I wanted to make was the kidney. If you start studying kidney physiology, you'll be amazed. The kidney is designed to excrete potassium. And that's because, like I said, I think our ancestors were probably eating more like 20, 25. I think Richard Moore was underestimated when he said he thinks it's 16 to 20. I think it's more than that if you look at the numbers. Okay, so it's designed to excrete potassium and to conserve sodium. When they checked the urine on the Yanomamo in the South American jungle on the border of Brazil and Venezuela, they were excreting next to 0 sodium in their urine because they don't have any added salt. They sort of live out in a jungle environment. And that's how powerful the kidney is. It can make up its mind, nope, we're not going to release any sodium into the urine. That's how strong it is. But we're very used to releasing tons of potassium into our urine. So what I'm trying to say is we got flat teeth to grind plant foods. Our jaw can go side to side to grind plant foods. We don't make vitamin C because it's in the plants. We got a long intestinal tract like plant-eating animals. And we got a kidney made to excrete potassium. That's what we're made to eat. All right. So anyways, I'm going to get into a little bit more of why diabetes is such a disaster. And one of the points I wanted to make is that almost all the patients have the same diseases. If let's say I get a phone call page from a resident, oh, I'm in the middle of a biopsy. I'm having problems. I'm in the middle of a spinal tap, a myelogram, or some other procedure. I'm having a problem. Could you please come down and help us out? Okay, so I got to go down there and help them out. I'll be in a hurry. I got 10 different things to do. I don't even need to look in the chart. I can tell you, I've been a doctor over 30 years. I know that patient will be probably overweight, not necessarily, but probably. They're going to be hypertensive, almost for certain. They're going to be pre-diabetic or diabetic, almost for certain. I don't even have to check the chart. I just assume that. I assume they have coronary artery disease. I assume they have cerebrovascular disease, gastroesophageal reflux, abdominal pressure syndrome, because all the patients have disease. I've looked at many, tens, hundreds of thousands of charts, okay, every day. All right, that's just what it is. When you eat the Western diet, those are the diseases you get. Okay, and I'm going to talk about how this is sort of the highway to health hell, that they all end up with these problems, and it's the same pattern of disease that pushes you into dementia. It's the same pattern of disease that pushes you into cancer, okay? They also end up losing their teeth, most of them cataracts, the spine's all degenerated. It's kind of a sad mess. All right, so here's the best book ever written about hypertension, Richard Moore's High Blood Pressure Solution. He's an MD PhD who spent his whole career working on ion pumps to understand hypertension. And another interesting book I read was by Nick Lane. He's an origin of life researcher, and he talks about a lot about the mitochondria and the proton pumps and the proton gradient. And well, first of all, here's a quote from Richard Moore, and this is an important quote. High insulin levels cause acidification of the extracellular space. So Richard Moore says when your insulin levels go up, as they do with high-fat diets and other things that cause insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes, you will get acid pumped into the extracellular space. I remember reading that, and I'm like, gee, that reminds me of cancer, but I didn't follow it up when I first learned that. But I go, gee, that sounds like cancer. Then I read Nick Lane, and he's like, all a bacteria wants to do is replicate. Bacteria have a proton gradient on their plasma membrane. So their plasma membrane, they pump protons out of there, then they have a cell wall around that. That space between their plasma membrane and their cell wall is called the periplasmic space. And that's analogous to the intramembranous space of mitochondria and human cells, eukaryotic cells. Okay? And Nick Lane describes it as an extracellular force field, that they all have it, like a proton power Star Trek Enterprise force field. So like this green thing around the Star Trek Enterprise from the old TV show with Captain Kirk, that's what it's like, okay? And that's going to become relevant, all right? So here's a paper, the effects of systemic and local acidosis on insulin resistance signaling. So the higher the insulin levels go, the more glycolysis you run, producing lactate and H+, hydrogen proton, and then these protons, so they don't accumulate too much inside the cell, they get pumped out into the extracellular space. So your H+ is acid, so you're pumping acid into the extracellular space, you're going to acidify it. Well, gee, bacteria do that. Now, in normal amounts, small amounts, it's normal. But you're going to start pumping a lot of these guys out there, especially when the insulin levels go high. All right. So what happens is you're going to get acidification of the extracellular space. And I color coded it. You're going to get alkalinization, meaning a more basic pH in the intracellular space. And that's going to have consequences for a cell. Remember that insulin is, in a sense, it's anabolic. It promotes storage of fat in fat cells, promotes storage of glucose in skeletal muscle cells. It's telling you food is abundant, glucose is abundant, take it on up, okay? All right, so what are some other things that happen? The acid feeds back and it'll cause some insulin resistance, generating a bit of a vicious cycle. One of the things that'll happen too, the more acidic it gets, there's a bit of a feedback mechanism that can partially block glycolysis, and you'll also start getting more glutamine metabolism. Glutamine is, if you'll remember, it's like the most common amino acid, and it can run through Krebs cycle and it can run backwards. The reason I'm telling you all this is, if you've read a lot of biochemistry on cancer, you'll think I'm talking about cancer right now. And what I'm trying to say is, elevated insulin levels have an effect very similar to cancer, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's because diabetics have increased cancer. Fat people have increased cancer. People who eat high-fat diets have increased cancer. It's part of the basic physiology that this triggers sort of an anabolic growth mechanism in cells, okay? High-fat diets cause insulin resistance, elevated insulin levels in the blood. Elevated insulin levels lead to acidification of the extracellular space. Acidification of the extracellular space feeds back and causes more insulin resistance, a vicious cycle mechanism, okay? You can switch over to glutamine, okay? But it's gonna get worse. I'm just warming you up. And I wrote deja vu because that should remind you. The high-fat diets also cause tissue hypoxia, and they're going to activate something called the HIF, hypoxia-inducible factor, with vascular endothelial growth factor pathway, VEGF, all right? That's going to come up too. And high-fat diets do all this stuff. And I says, does this sound similar to cancer metabolism? It should, because it is, okay? So this is just another slide just showing you that they sometimes call the exchanger for sodium and for hydrogen protons the NHE, and that just means natrium hydrogen exchanger. So the sodium hydrogen exchanger. So the sodium comes into the cell, and then the protons are pumped out. All right. Now here's another paper. This is a real smart Japanese guy named Marunaka. He said the roles of interstitial fluid pH in diabetes. And he's going to talk about diabetes associated with this pHE. What this means is pH of the E for extracellular space. It's acidified, so the pH goes down. When you have high insulin levels, you get more acidification of that space. And the reason is the space outside the cells is called the interstitial space. Sometimes they call it the extracellular space, extracellular matrix, because there's like three spaces that are relevant to us. There's the arterial lumen in the blood vessel. There is the intracellular space inside the cell. And then there's the third space, the interstitial space, all right? Now, the blood has very strong buffer system. It has a bicarbonate buffer system. It also has the capacity of proteins to bind to acid. Like your hemoglobin can bind to the acid. Your albumin, blood plasma protein can bind to the acid. So it keeps its pH pretty tightly regulated between 7.35 to 7.45. But the interstitial space, it doesn't have these buffer systems. So its pH can rapidly change. And that can be a big problem. It can't have a whole bunch of ions and buffer systems because then its osmolality will go too high, and that would affect its ability to send things back and forth to the capillary. We're not going to get into all that, but it just is the way it is. The extracellular space cannot control pH that effectively, okay? So what ends up happening is if you start having this insulin resistance and elevated insulin levels, you're going to be pumping. And diabetics have more acidification of their extracellular space. Again, it sounds like a bacteria. And what is cancer? A lot of people think cancer is basically a cell converting itself from a human cell into a bacterial cell, okay? Like a facultative anaerobe, okay? And the reason I talked earlier about the idea of the origin of life coming from the sea and initially it being anaerobic with no oxygen on the world, and life on Earth had to function in an anaerobic environment like with glycolysis or something, and then later on cyanobacteria developed photosynthesis, and then we had a mitochondria event where it was taken into a cell, endosymbiosis it's called. And so what I'm saying is the initial cells on Earth that were, eukaryotes with a nucleus and with mitochondria, they had to have the ability, the capacity of being a facultative anaerobe whereby they could go back to living without oxygen. They could switch back and forth between oxygen metabolism and non-oxygen. The benefit of oxygen metabolism is you can make tons of ATP. You can make about 18 ATP, 18 times more ATP per one glucose than you can with anaerobic metabolism. So there's a big energy advantage. All right, but this facultative anaerobe capacity kept them alive in times of short oxygen. All cells in the human body have the same DNA. And your immune cells, for example, they have to go anaerobic when they go deep into a wound and try to heal it, or deep into an infection and try to heal it. And then they're supposed to switch back to aerobic metabolism when they're at rest, hanging around with their friends inside a lymph node, okay? So what I'm saying is all cells in the human body have the same DNA, and this is buried deep in their pathways, okay? You got all this DNA sitting around, 3.3 billion base pairs, and these genes for conversion to facultative anaerobe, they exist, and they can be turned on in the setting of hypoxia, okay? And high-fat diets cause tissue hypoxia, like the Peter Quoll paper in the 1950s, 15 to 20% drop in oxygen delivery in the setting of a high-fat diet. Roy Swank got 35% or 30% drop in oxygen delivery to the brain with a high-fat diet. So that's a big part of it. There's more to it than that, but that's a big part, okay? So here's Maranaka going on. He's talking about diabetes is associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, and that's associated with anaerobic glycolysis energy production. Ketone bodies can also lead to this type of physiology. Okay. At physiologic pH, lactate is dissociated. So here's lactic acid. It's a carboxylic acid, meaning there's a carbon with a double bond to oxygen and a hydroxyl group right on top of it, right next to it, okay? And deprotonated means the proton, the H, has been removed. So now it's like this. So the name changes from lactic acid when it's protonated to lactate when it's not protonated. And then there would be an H plus over here, okay? So when the cell runs tons of glucose, glycolysis, you produce a lot more protons. When the insulin levels are high, you're going to produce more protons. They get pumped out of the cell. You acidify the extracellular matrix. This can become quite acidic, the interstitial space, the third space. The blood doesn't have these big pH shifts because it's got a great buffering system. Interstitial space does not. Inside the cell is able to control its pH better, but it does become alkalinized, having a more basic pH, and that will cause its enzyme systems to run differently, okay? Now, here's where this gets interesting. When you acidify the extracellular space, you have an excess amount of protons in the extracellular space. And just as they caused a problem with the binding affinity of insulin to its insulin receptor, leading to more insulin resistance, I mentioned that in the context of being a vicious cycle, you have here the excessive protons in a neuron. These are cells in your brain. So this is a presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron. These are the neurotransmitters being released into the synaptic cleft. They bind the postsynaptic receptor on the postsynaptic neuron and exert an effect. But what Maranaka showed is, guess what? The high amount of protons in the extracellular space, making it acidic, they change the binding affinity of some neurotransmitters to the receptor, and they can cause a change in neuronal function. Do you think that's going to be good for cognitive function? No, it's not. So this is one of the mechanisms whereby diabetes will cause impaired cognitive function, okay? And if you had to ask me, like, which patients have the worst cognitive function, I can tell you, I mean, the absolute worst cognitive function commonly seen would be like in kidney failure patients on dialysis. And the dialysis machine contributes to that, but they have very poor cognitive function. your obstructive sleep apnea patients, very poor cognitive function, okay? But your diabetics, marijuana smokers are notoriously kind of annoying and poor cognitive function. But your IV drug addicts, they have personality problems besides cognitive function problems. But your diabetes patients, they very often have real slow, poor cognitive function. They often simultaneously have obstructive sleep apnea, okay? But one of the things that not many people know is that in the old books, it would tell you that the brain doesn't depend on insulin. It's a non-issue for the brain. It's got glucose type 3 transporters in the neurons themselves, glucose type 1 in the blood-brain barrier, and these are not dependent on insulin. But they haven't read the papers. The neurons actually do have glucose type 4 transporters in addition to GLUT3s. All right, and the relevance is that these GLUT4s are dependent on insulin. And for the brain cell to increase its activity level, it wants to take in glucose through these GLUT4s. Okay, that's going to become a big deal in a second. I'll show you on this next slide. So let's say you're walking down a path in the forest. The reason you have a brain is so that you can walk down a path in a forest, a jungle, a prairie, and survive, okay? And your brain is always asking itself the question, is everything okay or not okay? Things are cool or they're not cool? If they're cool, not cool. Cool, not cool. Everything is cool, good. I like the smell of the flowers. It's a beautiful day. All right, all of a sudden, there's 3 coyotes coming towards you. Not cool. Okay, what am I going to do? All of a sudden, you're stressed out. You got to ramp up your energy level from 0 to 60 miles per hour real fast, okay, if you want to survive. Should I climb a tree? Should I try to fight? Should I stand my ground? What should I do? Okay, and so what I'm saying is the neurons have to be able to ramp up muscular activity, their commands to activate the muscles very fast. And they have a system whereby the endoplasmic reticulum, which is also stores calcium, has connections to the mitochondria. These are called MAMs, mitochondrial associated membranes. And in the setting of the need to rapidly ramp up activity, they will release calcium into the mitochondria, and it causes upregulation, increase in the Krebs cycle enzymes, so that the mitochondria can generate more ATP quickly. Now, when that happens simultaneously, this is a neuron's plasma membrane over here, the cell needs to bring in more glucose because glucose needs to flood into the cell, and then that has to run through glycolysis, go to pyruvate come in, run through Krebs cycle, generate the electron carriers, NADH, FADH2, to then pass those along the intermitochondrial membrane and make ATP. But here's the problem. If you've got insulin resistance, these glucose type 4 transporters, they can't go up to the plasma membrane. So now you got a problem because you're pushing calcium into the mitochondria, but it's not regulated as well as you would hope it would be. And there's a tendency to push too much calcium. So the mitochondria is like, let's go, guys, come on, let's go. But the glucose is not arriving. The cavalry is not arriving, but the calcium keeps coming in, and you'll sometimes precipitate your mitochondria here, and that'll further destroy the energy function of the cell. It can even go into apoptosis. So this is another way that diabetes can cause brain damage and cognitive decline. Okay, we talked about the basic stuff many times in the past. The main thing endothelial cells do, these are the lining cells of arteries, is produce nitric oxide. It's a gas, diffuses into lumen, prevents the platelets from clotting, diffuses into the wall of the artery, causes the smooth muscles to relax. Okay, when you get high calcium inside these smooth muscles, as you do with a high salt diet, they'll vasoconstrict. It has an inhibitory effect on nitric oxide, and that'll give you hypertension. And I'm going to show you the long-term effect of that. So here's a normal capillary in the brain. This is a brain cell, a neuron. The red blood cells travel through the capillary. They're denoted by the red. The spindle-shaped cells right here are the endothelial cells. The yellow thing on the outer wall of the capillary is the basement membrane. Okay, the green cells here are the muscle cells or pericytes around the capillaries and the small arteries. Well, in the setting of diabetes, you get glycation in the basement membrane and it gets thickened. Okay, so you get thickening of the capillary basement membrane. The blue circles are oxygen delivery from the red blood cell to the neuron. You'll also get hypertrophy of the vascular smooth muscles, okay, from the hypertension itself in response to the high pressures. You also have an anabolic hypertrophic effect in response to elevated insulin levels. You'll also lay down more collagen, which I didn't completely draw in here. All of these things decrease the ability of these red blood cells to deliver oxygen to your brain cells. So what I'm saying is at a baseline, in somebody chronically hypertensive and diabetic, this is all thickened and their oxygen delivery to the brain cells is compromised at a baseline. Then you superimpose a high-fat diet on that, a high-sodium diet on that, and it gets worse. Okay, I've talked to you before about the deltoid theory of dementia. You tie off a carotid artery, 2 months later, middle-aged and older mice is demented. He does an autopsy. There's no stroke. There's just atrophy, shrinkage due to apoptosis, gradual loss of brain cells due to a lack of blood flow. I talked to you about my theory of dementia, the Peter Rogers, MD theory of dementia, supply and demand. You got a baseline metabolic rate in a neuron, baseline oxygen glucose delivery. They have to be the same. Supply and demand must be matched. You can also call it neurovascular coupling, should be the same. But if you drop oxygen delivery due to high fat, high sodium meals, and then you simultaneously overactivate this due to psychological stress, sleep deprivation, corticosteroid meds, caffeine, attention deficit medications, any type of stimulant, nicotine, glyphosate's an excitotoxin, aspartame's an excitotoxin, MSG and MFG are excitotoxins. You're going to widen this gap between the energy delivery and the metabolic rate. The wider this gap gets, the more likely this neuron is going to go into apoptosis, programmed cell death. But it gets worse because I'm only giving you 2 variables here. There's a third variable is energy production. And that means how well is your mitochondrial function. So if you got all these inhibitors on board of mitochondrial function, you can't make ATP. That's the equivalent to making the gap wider, increasing the likelihood of brain cells being destroyed by apoptosis. We talked about sleep apnea, making people hypoxic at night. I've seen them drop their sats into the 60s at night with sleep apnea. Not good. O2 sats should be in the 90s. Okay. When a cell's in normoxia, has normal oxygen, you make something called hypoxic-inducible factor. Vitamin C contributes to its degradation pathway, the hydroxylate it. And normally you make it and then you get rid of it. You basically throw these ubiquination stickers on it that are like eat me, garbage disposal, and you go into something called this giant proteasome, like a wood chipper, chip, 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 chip. It just chops the protein into pieces. So the cell is always checking if it's got enough oxygen. It's ready if there's a problem, but most of the time it just gets destroyed quickly. The point is, in the context of a high-fat meal, high-sodium meal where you've made the tissue hypoxia, if you already have baseline atherosclerosis from diabetes and hypertension, for example, you can then get bad enough hypoxia that hypoxia-inducible factor will not be destroyed because there's no oxygen available to initially hydroxylate it, so you can't run these subsequent parts of the pathway. In this setting, the hypoxia-inducible factor subunit alpha goes into the nucleus, combines with hypoxia-inducible factor subunit beta, and it becomes a transcription factor, binding the promoter on the hypoxic response element and causing it to produce genes, activate genes, transcribe the genes to survive in an anaerobic environment, to make more anaerobic glycolysis enzymes and other related proteins. And it'll also activate something called VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, for angiogenesis, to produce new blood vessels. So this is why diabetes, which causes hypoxia, will cause new blood vessels on the back of the eyeball. It's called diabetic retinopathy, and that can cause blindness, okay? So what I'm trying to say, this is the same physiology you talk about when you're talking about hypoxia-induced cancer is what you're talking about in the context of diabetes. It's what you're talking about in the context of high-fat diets. So this is what I meant. This is the pathway to health. Okay, here's a paper, the role of sodium-hydrogen exchanger in the reprogramming of cancer metabolism. Okay, again, the pH can get as low as 6.2 in the extracellular space, okay? And that's like with cancer. And why do you think that's such a big deal with cancer? Because a low pH, meaning acidic, it suppresses the immune system. So cancer takes over a territory like an evil gang of thugs, and it basically, tells the it just pounds on the immune system with this acidity, and the immune system can't do anything. In this level of acidity, the immune system's paralyzed. It can't do anything. It just lets the cancer grow. Okay, so you don't want this. You don't want this to be happening. You don't want high insulin levels. You don't want acidification of the extracellular space. All cancer has this, okay? This guy, his name is Steve Reshkin, and this is sort of called the pH paradigm of cancer, okay? And just like cancer runs on anaerobic glycolysis primarily, that's called the Warburg effect. Even if oxygen is present, it's going to run on glycolysis. And this has also been called reverse evolution, okay? Regional hypoxia, increased glycolysis. All cancer has, this is a very famous paper. This is a very famous guy here, Stephen Reshkin, okay? All tumors have this character. This is cancer physiology, okay? And what I'm trying to say is, what causes this? What initiates this process? High-fat, high-sodium diets. Not good. The more acidic the cell is, extracellular, the more you suppress the immune system. You will simultaneously alkalinize the cell inside. So PHI means pH intracellular. So when you are acidic, then you're going to be running glycolysis, like a positive PET scan with a cancer, okay? And it's like a thermostat, okay? When the intracellular cell is now the opposite of that, you're going to run more oxygen, okay? So but what I'm trying to tell you is this pH concept is real useful. It's telling you what's happened. You're pushing yourself into cancer-like physiology with high-fat diets and high-sodium diets, okay? Especially the high-fat. The earliest step in metabolic programming of a cell is the reversal of the pH, intracellular versus extracellular. This is the words of Stephen Reshkin, a real famous cancer researcher. This is the cornerstone of cancer metabolism. It creates a vicious cycle. After excess glycolysis produces 2 protons with each cycle, the cell has to pump out the protons or it would die from internal acidosis, okay? This is the sodium-hydrogen exchanger activity levels increased. And then you get alkalinization of the intracellular pH, okay? And that drives obligate tumor DNA synthesis. You go into, because you can switch the direction on Krebs cycle and you can go into synthetic mode, okay? Which cancer wants. So in a sense, a regular cell is a team player. Like let's say you're a liver cell. You got a job to do. You got to maintain blood glucose for the brain. You got to detoxify chemicals. You got to produce bile. You got to run gluconeogenesis. You need to make lots of ATP, lots of energy. You got to work. Okay, but if you're a bacteria cell, what a cancer cell is like, it's like, remember the song Johnny Paycheck? Take this job and shove it. I'm hypoxic. I can't make enough energy, so I ain't doing no more work. And I don't even want to live here anymore. I'm just going to replicate myself, fool around, and then I'm going to move somewhere else. So like a selfish bacteria, the cancer cell just wants to replicate itself and then metastasize, spread to other location, okay? The tumor microenvironment is characterized by hypoxia and a poor blood supply. There is limited nutrient availability, supply of glucose and oxygen. The pH is acidic in the extracellular space. Acidic extracellular space promotes production of more collagen in the extracellular space. That's bad. It's a vicious cycle because that's going to drop oxygenation of the cells as well. Whereas an alkaline extracellular space would promote removal of the collagen, okay? Vicious cycle. That's what's happening. You're just making itself worse. All right, so this is what I meant also by the concept of reverse evolution. Instead of going from single cell bacteria, prokaryote, to eukaryote, to multicellular organism, to humans, in a sense, we're going backwards. So that's kind of the joke here of reverse evolution. So here's another paper just saying the same thing. When you alkalinize the intracellular environment from this type of physiology, you'll run the pentose phosphate pathway, which is analogous to glycolysis. It's the synthetic pathway for making nucleotides, the ribose component. Multicellularity is for mitochondria and oxygen breathers. So here's another paper to this effect. Tumor metabolism reflects reverse evolution. The dismantling of multicellularity, the idea of moving backwards from a multicellular organism to become like a unicellular bacteria, okay? Selfish, only interested in replicating, functioning anaerobically, okay? Alkaline intracellular pH inhibits mitochondria, causes mitochondrial atrophy, and it can make the mitochondria just non-functional, which in a sense is good for cancer because it makes them immortal. The mitochondria is like the path to running apoptosis pathways. Okay, so if you destroy the mitochondria and its apoptosis ability, then hey, that cell, you can't kill that cell in the usual way. So this author says carcinogenesis can be seen as reverse evolution, the dismantling of multicellularity. The cancer cell becomes a unicellular microorganism, then my words here, like a bacteria. Losing some complex features can be an advantage for cancer growth. Yep, cancer is like a monster, like a bacterial monster. Okay, and so like I said, here it is, team player, multicellular, oxygen environment, aerobic, lots of ATP energy production, to going backwards, being like a bacteria, anaerobic, selfish, doesn't care about the liver or anything else in the human, just wants to grow for itself. Okay, so here's my point. Like, why do I think this is an academic orgasm and so beautiful and important? Because we've already known for a long time, you're screwed with the high-fat diets in a sense that you get the blood slugs and that causes tissue hypoxia, that causes hypertension. The high fat causes insulin resistance. But some of the things I said today, I think most of the audience is not familiar with. That the high insulin levels also lead to acidification of the extracellular space, and that then generates cancer-like metabolism. In addition, it suppresses the immune system, so the immune system cannot remove the cancer. So you don't want this. And that's why cancer patients, their diet is also important. So they stop acidifying their extracellular space so their immune system will be able to function and hopefully remove the cancer and control it. because otherwise you're screwed. You can see a high-fat diet's a disaster for cancer. All right. I thought that was kind of fascinating, this idea of the pH paradigm, the extracellular acidification being a major part of cancer. And elevated insulin levels cause that, as in high-fat diets cause that. And how the whole physiology of high-fat diets and tissue hypoxia is basically analogous to cancer. Okay, and the high sodium diet dissipating the battery, we talked about that, and then how it increases because you dissipated that sodium battery and capacity to pump calcium out of a cell. You're going to have higher cytoplasm calcium in every single cell in your body, including your pancreatic beta cells, causing more release of insulin. Okay, some cells are more sensitive than other ones, but you see the problem. You're going to elevate your insulin levels. That in and of itself is going to cause some insulin resistance. So it's bad. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then here's my old Spartan vegan diet, which is basically like the McDougall diet, low-fat vegan diet. We talked about that before. Anyways, I thought that was kind of interesting.
That was beautiful, Peter. So that's basically one diet to rule them all. No matter, pick your disease, and the low-fat vegan diet is going to be the best. And calcium is the boss, you said. Pick up your room. That's great ways to remember a lot of these things. Dr. Rogers, thank you so much again for taking the time to share these insights today. I didn't realize this was going to be a cancer talk, but it's all connected, I guess. And yeah, I
was trying to motivate people because in my experience, most diabetics are like, my diabetes is okay. It's under control. I'm taking my pills. My sugars are okay. It's under control. They don't understand. There's a whole bunch of things happening in the background that are not good. They don't want long term.
Yeah, no, it's more than just about symptoms or managing systems. You reverse one disease, you can do more than that. Anyhow, for those of you that are watching today, if you want to look deeper, Dr. Rogers' new book, Prevent and Reverse Diabetes, it's available now. I'm going to put a link in the description so you can check it out. That is it for today. If you found the conversation helpful, make sure to like it, share it, subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment or a question. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.